It all started in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in the suburbs of California, the kind of place where the lawns were always perfectly manicured. The houses looked like they belonged in a magazine, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist. Everyone knew the HOA was strict. Some would say too strict. They had rules for everything. The height of your grass, the color of your mailbox, even the type of flowers you could plant in your front yard. If you broke the rules, you'd get a warning. If you ignored the warning, well, let's just say you didn't want to find out. My sister, Clara, had moved into the neighborhood about a year ago. She wasn't the kind of person who sought attention. In fact, she was the opposite. Clara was quiet, reserved, and always kept to herself. She had been in a car accident a few years back that left her paralyzed from the waist down, so she used a wheelchair to get around. Despite everything she'd been through, Clara never complained. She was strong, stronger than anyone I knew, but she was also fiercely private. She didn't like people fussing over her or treating her differently because of her disability. That's why, when she moved into the neighborhood, she didn't tell anyone about her job or her position. To everyone else, she was just Clara, the woman in the wheelchair who lived in the blue house on Maple Street. Clara's house was modest compared to some of the mansions in the neighborhood, but it was cozy and welcoming. She'd had a ramp installed at the front entrance so she could easily get in and out of the house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple, sturdy ramp made of wood. But to Clara, it was essential. It gave her independence, and that was something she valued more than anything. The trouble started about 6 months after Clara moved in. One morning, I was visiting her when she showed me a letter she'd received from the HOA. It was written in that cold, formal tone that made it clear they weren't messing around. "Dear resident," the letter began, "it has come to our attention that the structure at the front entrance of your property violates the community's aesthetic guidelines. Specifically, the wooden ramp does not conform to the approved architectural standards. You are hereby instructed to remove the ramp within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action." Clara sighed as she handed me the letter. "Can you believe this?" she said, shaking her head. "They want me to remove the ramp. How am I supposed to get in and out of my house without it?" I could see the frustration in her eyes. Clara wasn't the type to make a scene, but this was different. This was about her ability to live her life. She decided to try reasoning with the HOA. She wrote them a polite letter explaining her situation and why the ramp was necessary. She even offered to make some changes to the design if they thought it was too unsightly. But the HOA wasn't interested in compromise. A week later, another letter arrived. This one was even more blunt than the first. "The ramp must be removed immediately. No exceptions." Clara was at a loss. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also couldn't just give up her independence. She decided to reach out to a lawyer, hoping they could help her navigate the situation. But before she could even schedule a meeting, something happened that changed everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when I got the call from Clara. Her voice was trembling, and I could tell something was wrong. "You need to come over," she said. "Right now." I rushed to her house, my heart pounding. When I got there, I couldn't believe what I saw. The ramp, the one that had been there just the day before, was gone. In its place was a pile of splintered wood and debris, and standing in the driveway was a bulldozer, its engine still running. A group of HOA representatives stood nearby, looking smug and self-satisfied. Clara was sitting in her wheelchair at the edge of the driveway, her face pale with shock. They just showed up and tore it down," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't even warn me. They didn't even care." I felt a surge of anger as I looked at the mess they'd made. How could they do this? How could they be so heartless? I wanted to scream at them, to demand an explanation. But before I could say anything, Clara put a hand on my arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "It's not worth it." But I could see the determination in her eyes. Clara wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't the kind of person who sought revenge, but she also wasn't the kind of person who let people walk all over her. And as I stood there, staring at the wreckage of her ramp, I realized something. The HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. Clara wasn't just my sister. She wasn't just the woman in the wheelchair who lived in the blue house on Maple Street. She was Clara Mitchell, the governor of California, and they were about to find out exactly what that meant. The days following the destruction of Clara's ramp were tense. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, but no one dared to confront the HOA directly. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara, however, was eerily calm. She didn't yell or cry or demand justice. Instead, she sat in her living room, her wheelchair positioned by the window, staring out at the pile of splintered wood that had once been her lifeline to independence. I stayed with her those first few days, partly because I was worried about her and partly because I didn't want her to face this alone. But Clara wasn't the type to wallow in self-pity. By the third day, she had a plan. "I'm going to call a press conference," she said one morning over coffee. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. I nearly choked on my drink. "A press conference? Clara, are you sure? You've always been so private about your disability. Do you really want to put yourself out there like that?" She set her mug down and looked at me, her expression serious. "This isn't just about me anymore. If they can do this to me, they can do it to anyone. Someone has to stand up to them." I wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't owe anyone anything, but I knew better. Once Clara made up her mind, there was no changing it. And deep down, I knew she was right. The press conference was scheduled for that Friday. Clara didn't tell anyone what she was planning, not even her staff. She wanted it to be a surprise. On the morning of the conference, I helped her get ready. She wore a sharp navy blue suit, her hair neatly styled, and a determined look on her face. She looked every bit the powerful woman she was, but there was something different about her, something fierce. We arrived at the city hall just before 10 a.m. The room was already packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Clara wheeled herself to the podium, and the room fell silent. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands resting on the arms of her wheelchair, her eyes scanning the crowd. Then she began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Clara Mitchell, and I am the governor of California. But today, I'm not here to talk about policy or legislation. Today, I'm here to talk about something much more personal." She paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath. "A few days ago, the homeowners association in my neighborhood destroyed the wheelchair ramp at my home. They did this without warning, without permission, and without any regard for the fact that I rely on that ramp to live my life. They told me it was unsightly and that it violated their aesthetic guidelines. But what they really meant was that they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to be reminded that people like me exist." The room erupted in murmurs, but Clara held up a hand, silencing them. "I've always been a private person. I didn't want my disability to define me, and I didn't want special treatment because of it. But what happened to me isn't just about a ramp. It's about a system that values appearances over accessibility, that prioritizes rules over people. And it's about a culture that too often ignores the needs of those who are different." She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "I'm here today to say that this ends now. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. I will be introducing new legislation to strengthen accessibility laws and hold HOAs accountable for discriminatory practices. And I will be pursuing legal action against the HOA in my neighborhood to ensure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." The room exploded with questions, but Clara didn't stick around to answer them. She turned her wheelchair and rolled off the stage, leaving the reporters scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. Back at her house, Clara seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But the fight was far from over. That afternoon, her phone started ringing off the hook. News outlets from across the country wanted to interview her. Advocacy groups reached out to offer their support. And, of course, the HOA was furious. By the end of the day, Clara's story was everywhere. It was on the news, on social media, in newspapers. People were outraged. How could something like this happen to the governor of all people? If she wasn't safe from discrimination, who was? The HOA, for their part, tried to defend their actions. They released a statement claiming that they had followed the rules and that Clara had been given ample warning. But their excuses fell flat in the face of public outrage. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Clara was trending, and protests were being organized outside the HOA's office. Clara, meanwhile, stayed focused. She spent the next few days meeting with her legal team and drafting the new legislation she had promised. She also reached out to disability rights organizations, asking for their input and support. It was as if the incident had lit a fire in her, and she wasn't going to stop until she had made a real difference. As for me, I couldn't have been prouder of her. Clara had always been my hero, but seeing her stand up to the HOA with such strength and determination was something else entirely. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been marginalized or overlooked, and she was doing it with a grace and dignity that left me in awe. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight, and neither was Clara. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes were higher than ever. And as much as I wanted to protect my sister, I knew that this was her fight. All I could do was stand by her side and watch as she changed the world, one ramp at a time. The days following Clara's press conference were a whirlwind. The story of the HOA bulldozing the governor's wheelchair ramp had gone viral, and the backlash was swift and unrelenting. Social media was flooded with outrage, hashtags like #Justice for Clara and #Rampgate trending for days. News outlets ran segments dissecting the incident, and disability rights organizations rallied behind Clara, amplifying her message and demanding accountability. But not everyone was on her side. The HOA, stubborn and defensive, dug their heels in. They released a series of statements doubling down on their actions, claiming they were simply enforcing the rules of the community. They even went so far as to suggest that Clara was using her position as governor to bully them into making exceptions. It was a tone-deaf response that only fueled the public's anger. Meanwhile, Clara remained focused. She spent her days working tirelessly on the new accessibility legislation she had promised, meeting with lawmakers, activists, and legal experts to ensure it was comprehensive and impactful. But behind the scenes, the stress was starting to take its toll. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, the way she rubbed her temples after long hours of work. She was determined, but she was also human. One evening, as we sat in her living room, I finally broached the subject. "Clara, you're doing an amazing job, but you can't keep going like this. You need to take a break. Let someone else handle this for a while." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers in her lap. "I can't. This is too important. If I stop now, they'll think they've won." "They're not going to win," I said firmly. "But you can't fight this battle if you're running on empty. You need to take care of yourself." She didn't respond, but I could tell she was listening. The next morning, she surprised me by suggesting we take a walk around the neighborhood. It was a rare moment of respite, and I jumped at the chance to spend some time with her outside of the chaos. As we made our way down the sidewalk, I couldn't help but notice the changes in the neighborhood. Several houses now had "We Stand with Clara" signs in their yards, and a few neighbors waved or offered words of encouragement as we passed. But there were also signs of tension. A handful of homes displayed "Support the HOA" banners, and the air felt thick with unspoken conflict. We were about halfway through our walk when we saw it. Parked in front of Clara's house was a sleek black car with tinted windows. Standing beside it was a man in a suit, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. As we approached, he stepped forward, blocking our path. "Governor Mitchell," he said, his voice cold and formal. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA. We need to talk." Clara's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Fine, let's talk." The man introduced himself as Richard Hayes, the HOA's lead attorney. He was tall and imposing, with a demeanor that screamed authority. He didn't waste any time getting to the point. "Governor, this situation has gotten out of hand. The negative publicity is damaging the reputation of our community, and it's time to put an end to it. We're prepared to offer you a settlement, a generous one, in exchange for dropping your legal action and refraining from further public statements." Clara's eyes narrowed. A settlement? You think you can buy me off? Hayes shrugged. Call it what you want, but the fact remains that this is a no-win situation for both of us. Accept the settlement, and we can all move on. For a moment, Clara was silent. Then she leaned forward in her wheelchair, her voice low and steady. Let me make something very clear. This isn't about money. This is about accountability. You destroyed my ramp, my independence, without a second thought. And if you think I'm going to let you sweep this under the rug, you're sorely mistaken. Hayes's expression hardened. Governor, I strongly advise you to reconsider. If you continue down this path, you're not just going up against the HOA. You're going up against some very powerful people. People who don't take kindly to being challenged. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, but Clara didn't flinch. Is that a threat, Mr. Hayes? He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said it all. Without another word, he turned and got back into his car, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. As the car drove away, I turned to Clara. What are you going to do? She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair. I'm going to fight, no matter what it takes. That night, Clara called an emergency meeting with her legal team. They worked late into the night, drafting a response to the HOA's settlement offer and preparing for the legal battle ahead. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Hayes's warning had been clear, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of forces Clara was up against. The next morning, my fears were realized. Clara's office was flooded with calls from reporters asking about a leaked document that allegedly showed Clara using her position as governor to influence the HOA's decisions. It was a blatant lie, but the damage was done. The narrative was shifting, and Clara was suddenly on the defensive. As the day wore on, the pressure mounted. Clara's opponents seized on the opportunity, using the leaked document to discredit her and undermine her credibility. Social media was flooded with accusations and conspiracy theories, and even some of her supporters began to question her motives. By the time I got to her house that evening, Clara looked exhausted. She was sitting in her living room, staring at the TV as news anchors dissected the latest developments. When she saw me, she turned off the TV and sighed. They're trying to break me, she said quietly, but they don't know how strong I am. I sat down beside her, my heart aching for her. Clara, you don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. Let us help you. She looked at me, her eyes filled with determination. I'm not giving up. Not now. Not ever. And with that, Clara Mitchell, the woman who had always been my hero, rolled up her sleeves and prepared to fight the battle of her life. The stakes were higher than ever, but if there was one thing I knew about my sister, it was that she never backed down from a challenge. And this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. And that was a fight worth fighting. The days following the leaked document were some of the darkest I'd ever seen Clara go through. The media frenzy was relentless, and the public's opinion seemed to shift overnight. What had started as a clear-cut case of discrimination was now muddied with accusations and doubt. Clara's opponents seized the opportunity to paint her as a power-hungry politician using her position to bully a small HOA. Even some of her allies began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with the controversy. But Clara refused to back down. She knew the truth, and she was determined to prove it. The problem was the HOA had played their cards well. The leaked document, though fabricated, was convincing enough to cast doubt, and the longer the narrative lingered, the harder it became to fight. One evening, as we sat in her living room, Clara received a call from her chief of staff, Mark. His voice was tense as he delivered the news. Clara, we've got a problem. The HOA just filed a countersuit. They're claiming defamation and emotional distress. They're also demanding that you retract your statements and issue a public apology. Clara's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. On what grounds? They're saying your press conference damaged their reputation and caused them undue stress. They're also claiming you've been harassing them behind the scenes. I could see the anger flash in Clara's eyes, but she didn't lose her composure. Thank you, Mark. Let's schedule a meeting with the legal team first thing tomorrow. We need to figure out our next move. After she hung up, I turned to her. "Clara, this is getting out of hand. They're trying to bury you." She nodded, her expression grim. "I know, but they've made one mistake. They underestimated me." The next morning, Clara's legal team arrived at her house, armed with files and laptops. They spent hours going over every detail of the case, looking for any angle they could use to turn the tide. But the HOA had covered their tracks well. The leaked document, though fake, was difficult to disprove without concrete evidence. Just when it seemed like they were hitting a wall, Clara's personal assistant, Emily, burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "Clara, you need to see this." She handed Clara her tablet, and we all crowded around to see what had her so worked up. It was an email from an anonymous sender with a single attachment, a video file. Clara clicked on it, and the room fell silent as the video began to play. It was security footage from the day the HOA bulldozed her ramp. The video clearly showed the HOA president, Margaret Collins, standing beside the bulldozer, giving the order to proceed. But what was even more damning was the audio. As the bulldozer tore through the ramp, Collins turned to one of her associates and said, "Let's see how she likes being stuck in her house. Maybe she'll learn to follow the rules." The room erupted in gasps. Clara's lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah, was the first to speak. "This is it. This is the smoking gun we've been looking for. If this gets out, it's game over for the HOA." Clara leaned back in her wheelchair, a small smile playing on her lips. "Send it to the press, every major outlet, and schedule another press conference. It's time to end this." Within hours, the video was everywhere. News channels interrupted their regular programming to air it, and social media exploded with outrage. The public's opinion shifted once again, this time firmly in Clara's favor. The HOA's countersuit crumbled under the weight of the evidence, and Margaret Collins was forced to resign in disgrace. But Clara wasn't done yet. At her press conference, she stood, or rather sat, tall and confident, her voice ringing out with authority. "This was never just about me. It was about standing up to a system that values appearances over accessibility, rules over people. And it was about sending a message. Discrimination will not be tolerated. Not in my neighborhood, not in my state, not anywhere." The room erupted in applause, but Clara wasn't finished. "I'm proud to announce that the new accessibility legislation I've been working on will be introduced to the state legislature next week. This bill will ensure that no one else has to go through what I went through. It's time to make our communities inclusive for everyone." As the press conference ended, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Clara had faced down one of the toughest challenges of her life, and she had come out on top. But more than that, she had turned a personal struggle into a powerful movement for change. That night, as we celebrated with her team, Clara pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being there for me. I couldn't have done this without you." I smiled, feeling a lump in my throat. "You're my sister. I'll always be here for you." And as I looked at her, I knew that this was just the beginning. Clara had always been a force to be reckoned with, but now, she was unstoppable. And the world was about to find out just how much of a difference one determined woman could make. The weeks following the release of the damning video were a whirlwind. Clara's story had captured the nation's attention, and her fight for accessibility and justice became a rallying cry for people across the country. The HOA, once a symbol of power and control, was now a cautionary tale. Margaret Collins's resignation was just the beginning. Soon, the entire board was replaced, and the new leadership pledged to make the community more inclusive. But Clara wasn't content to stop there. She had promised change, and she was determined to deliver. The accessibility legislation she had been working on, now dubbed the Mitchell Accessibility Act, was introduced to the state legislature with overwhelming support. The bill aimed to strengthen existing laws, ensuring that no one could be denied reasonable accommodations for disabilities, whether in housing, public spaces, or workplaces. It also included provisions to hold HOAs and other governing bodies accountable for discriminatory practices. The day of the vote was tense. Clara had poured her heart and soul into this bill, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. I sat in the gallery of the state capitol, watching as lawmakers debated the merits of the legislation. Clara, seated in her wheelchair on the floor of the assembly, listened intently, her expression calm but determined. When it was her turn to speak, the room fell silent. Clara wheeled herself to the podium, her presence commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and strong. "This bill is not just about ramps and railings, it's about dignity. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of their abilities, has the opportunity to live a full and independent life. It's about recognizing that accessibility is not a privilege, it's a right." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like your needs don't matter. But I also know that change is possible. This bill is a step toward a more inclusive future, and I urge you to vote in favor of it. Not for me, but for the millions of people who deserve to be seen, heard, and valued." The room erupted in applause, and when the vote was called, the result was unanimous. The Mitchell Accessibility Act passed with overwhelming support, marking a historic moment for disability rights in the state. Clara's colleagues surrounded her, offering congratulations and handshakes, but she remained humble, deflecting the praise onto the advocates and activists who had worked alongside her. As we left the Capitol that evening, Clara seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But she wasn't done yet. The passage of the bill was just the beginning. Now came the hard work of implementation and enforcement. Clara spent the next several months traveling across the state, meeting with community leaders, business owners, and advocacy groups to ensure the new laws were understood and followed. She also launched a statewide initiative to raise awareness about accessibility issues, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had long been ignored. One of the most poignant moments came during a visit to a small town in Northern California. Clara had been invited to speak at the grand opening of a new community center that had been designed with accessibility in mind. As she cut the ribbon, she looked out at the crowd and smiled. "This," she said, "is what progress looks like. It's not just about building ramps or widening doorways. It's about building a world where everyone belongs." The crowd cheered, and I felt a lump in my throat. Clara had always been my hero, but seeing her in that moment, surrounded by people whose lives she had touched, was something else entirely. She had turned a personal struggle into a movement, and her impact would be felt for generations to come. Back at home, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be for the governor of California. Clara's ramp was rebuilt, this time with the full support of the HOA, and her house once again became a place of peace and refuge. But the experience had changed her in ways that were impossible to ignore. She was more confident, more outspoken, and more determined than ever to fight for what was right. One evening, as we sat on her porch watching the sunset, I turned to her. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't fought back? If you just accepted the settlement and walked away?" Clara smiled, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Every day. But I knew I couldn't let them win. This was never just about me. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. And if my story can inspire even one person to do the same, then it was all worth it." I nodded, feeling a swell of pride. Clara had always been strong, but this experience had shown me just how much of a difference one person could make. She had faced down one of the toughest challenges of her life and emerged stronger, more determined, and more committed to her values than ever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I realized that Clara's legacy wasn't just about the laws she had passed or the battles she had won. It was about the way she had inspired people to believe in the power of change. She had shown us that no matter how daunting the odds, we all have the ability to make a difference, if only we have the courage to try. And as I looked at my sister, my hero, I knew that her story was far from over. She had already changed the world in so many ways, but I had a feeling the best was yet to come.